Well, good morning. It's it's good to see you all here again as we are entering a new season of Shalom's life. Now that we have gotten past Labor Day weekend, we're beginning kind of the fall season of church life, a time when we have new Sunday school classes, when there's new leadership in some of our commissions. And as Brad mentioned, we're starting a new sermon series, a study of the book of Amos. And as I was preparing for this study and this Sunday, I couldn't help but remember the first time that I read the book of Amos. I was in my mid-20s, and up to this point, I had considered myself to be a fairly knowledgeable person about the Bible. I knew almost all of the classic stories from the Older Testament, from Sunday schools, and just being around Christian circles. I had significant portions of the New Testament memorized, but there were parts of the Older Testament, in particular that cluster of minor prophets in the last section, that I hadn't even read. So I decided that, I really needed to get past this and discipline myself to read through the Bible, a process which took me many years. By the time I got to Amos, I was excited, though, because I had heard good things about it. I knew that I had some professors Bible professors from college who really liked the book of Amos. I knew that the famous theologian Reinhold Niebuhr considered Amos to have been one of the most important influences on his theology. I knew that Dr. Martin Luther King seemed to be especially drawn to Amos. It was the first book that he preached about when he had an opportunity to preach as a pastor. And he referenced it both in his I Have a Dream speech and his letter from Birmingham jail. So there were people whom I respected, whom I looked up to, who just thought Amos was great. And so I was ready to be inspired, and I opened it, and I found what you just heard today, right? It's like this series of challenging statements. And there are a few things that I thought made it particularly challenging to read Amos rather than inspiring as I had hoped, especially in these first two chapters. So first of all, it's very repetitive. Did you notice that? It seems to be saying the same thing over and over again, and not in a way that I found exciting, but in a way that seemed monotonous. So it starts out with this line early on that says, "For 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment." And then it goes on to say a few more things about Damascus. And then just a few verses later, "For 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment." On and on. And then a few verses later, "For 3 transgressions of Tyre, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment." And again, and again, and again. And it's hard not to feel your eyes starting to glaze over after you get to about the 3rd or 4th place of transgressions. It also doesn't help that a lot of these places felt very unfamiliar to me, right? There were names that I didn't know, people like Ben-Hadad, some of these places, the Valley of Avim, the land of Ker. These are things that even in my growing up in church world had never stood out to me, or that I couldn't remember anything about at all. And that makes it hard to get into a book like Amos, because all of these references feel kind of irrelevant, right? Like it's something that maybe mattered in his time, but that doesn't have any bearing on us today. And then if though you could discipline yourself to read through this repetitive material and weigh through all of the names and unfamiliar stuff to try to get to the core message, even the core message itself didn't feel particularly inspiring or uplifting. It felt like a message of judgment, right? So just to go back to that first set, for example, where it says, "For 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment because they have threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron. So I will send a fire on the house of Hazael, and it shall devour the strongholds of Ben-Hadad. I will break the gate bars of Damascus and cut off the inhabitants, and the people of Aram shall go into exile to Kir, says the Lord. Well, that just sounds mean, right? Like, why are we finding this to be inspiring? My understanding of God is that God is a God of judgment and mercy, and not judgment, a God of love and mercy and grace. So it was hard for me to get past this series of statements of judgment. How could it be that this book was one that so many people that I had looked up to found to be so inspiring? Well, when it comes to the book of Amos, perhaps more so than most books in the Bible, I think it is true that knowing a little bit about its history and its context and the references that it makes goes a long way in helping us to be able to appreciate the book. Even just in terms of simple clarifying things, right? So in chapter 2, you heard Brad read a reference to Israel. And when we hear Israel, our first instinct, as most average Christians, is to go back to kind of the timeline in the Bible that we have, and we think about the united kingdom of Israel that's described in the Bible, right? So now dates are somewhat hazy when you're talking about things this back, but maybe just to give a general ballpark, a little bit before 1000 BC is the time when Saul becomes the king of the united tribes of Israel, and then shortly after that, David ushers in what we think of as the golden age of Israel's history, the time when the 12 tribes were together and they were defeating their enemies, and then Solomon builds the temple and they were worshiping God and things were good. In reality, that was more of the minority of Israel's history, because it wasn't long after that, really not even a period of 100 years, when the kingdom of Israel split under Solomon's son, Rehoboam, right? Rehoboam comes to power, and he tries to raise taxes and deals a strong hand, and 10 of the 12 tribes leave. They say, nope, we are not following you anymore. Instead, they follow a person named Jeroboam the First, important because we're dealing with Jeroboam the Second, who's a totally different person. But even though they have left behind Jerusalem and David's descendants on the throne down there, they now call themselves Israel. I mean, they're 10 of the 12 tribes, so they've kept the name Israel, whereas the southern part that remained is now called Judah. So we're in a time when the kingdom had split, and you have to remember how much this split just threw everything off. It messed with all of the institutions, including the religious ones, right? So there had been prophets, for example, in Israel for a long time. And when we read about this united period, it seems like the prophets had kind of a privileged place in the community. You might remember the prophet Nathan, for example, is a prophet who seems to be one of David's advisors, and is even able to call David out when he does things wrong. But instead of being punished for that, David listens to him. He honors him. He's glad to have one of God's prophets in his court. After the kingdom splits, though, the status of prophets started to get increasingly shaky. If there were enough prophets out there that if you were saying something that people didn't want to hear, they'd send you away and they would listen to somebody else. It's particularly well known that during the time of Ahab and Jezebel, there was persecution against the prophets. Prophets were being killed. They felt like they had to flee in order to save their lives. And that's when Elijah shows up on the scene, right? He is the one who stands face to face with Ahab and tells him, what you're doing is wrong, you're violating the ways of God, you're mistreating your people, and he has to go on the run. But he starts a new kind of school of prophecy. There are these prophets who surround him. He ends up appointing Elisha as his successor by passing his mantle on to Elisha. So there's kind of this prophetic tradition. A school is a little bit, it's not quite like we would think of a school today, but there is kind of a prophetic training that you could get. But unfortunately, our text comes even more than 100 years after that, and things had changed again. It occurs during the reign of King Jeroboam II. Now, Jeroboam II is not a king that the Bible really likes to talk about very much. He's described. There's some description of him in, the reference is wrong, but the passage is right. It comes from 2 Kings chapter 14. And it says, in the 15th year of King Amaziah, son of Joash of Judah, King Jeroboam, son of Joash, began to reign in Samaria. He reigned 41 years, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, I just want to note that these two sentences were hard to utter next to each other, because there was this understanding that if you did what was right, then you would be blessed, and if you did what was wrong, then you would face consequences for that. But Jeroboam had one of the longest reigns in Israel's history. He reigned for 41 years. That is a long time. But he also did evil. He wasn't a king who was committed to the ways of God. And that was hard to wrap their minds around. So this long reign by itself already creates a situation of political stability. There had been in the northern kingdoms past several situations where one regime would overthrow another regime, would overthrow another. But Jeroboam himself was a third generation king, so there was already some stability going into his reign. And he reigned for 40 years. And that is the kind of situation that allows businesses to grow, that allows trade relationships to get comfortable. So there's a lot of benefit that came from him having this long reign. And then in addition to just being on the throne for a long time, he was also militarily successful. Another thing that 2 Kings chapter 14 kind of begrudgingly mentions to us, right? It says that he expanded the territory of the northern kingdom. He defeated some of Israel's key enemies, including Damascus, whom you might remember we'd heard mentioned at the beginning of the book of Amos. And as a result of this, he brought great wealth to the kingdom. This is something that we know from archaeology even more than from the biblical record, that we find that during the time of Jeroboam II, that seems to be the time when Israel was really flourishing, when the population was at its highest, when they seemed to be doing as well, if not better, than all of the other nations in that region. But another point that Amos makes that I think is important for us today is that somehow Jeroboam had seemed to gain control over that school of prophecy, right? So Elijah was a kind of rebel prophet, right? Like he spoke out against Ahab when nobody else would. He started this new tradition. There were prophets who followed him and prophets who followed them, and on and on and on. But the problem is that any institution, no matter how noble or heroic it is in its origins, can lose its way, can lose its prophetic edge. And so by the time we get to Amos's time, those prophets are still around, but they're just not doing or saying anything all that valuable. Amos says it like this: I raised up some of your children to be prophets and some of your youths to be Nazirites. Is it not indeed so, O people of Israel? Says the Lord. But you made the Nazirites drink wine and commanded the prophets, saying, you shall not prophesy. Don't say anything that would offend us, anything that makes us look bad. Maybe they were still allowed to offer these kind of oracles or proclamations against other nations. But when it came to real substantive prophecy, Israel basically told its prophets that they didn't want to hear it anymore. And that was a problem, because the last thing that we know about Jeroboam is that he exploited and oppressed, particularly the poor people in his land. Yes, that there was wealth that was coming into Israel, but it was a very centralized wealth. The king had dominated all these enemies. They probably sent him tribute, and he wanted to use that to build up palaces and power and beds of ivory and things that would make him look good, instead of caring for his people. This is also something that Amos calls out already in our reading this morning. For 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and needy for a pair of sandals. They who trample the head of the poor into dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. And unfortunately, none of the prophets were doing their job and speaking up for this community of people who was protected in the law of Moses, who were being persecuted before their very eyes. And that is when the ministry of Amos began. So when we actually start to read the words of Amos, the very first thing that it tells us is that he was among the shepherds of Tekoa. Now, we've gotten used to the fact that, being a shepherd can be a good thing for religious people, right? David was a shepherd, and Jesus often used shepherd imagery. Even the word pastor is etymologically from the concept of shepherd, so that's not difficult for us to wrap our minds around. But at his time, that would have been quite unusual. Because remember, at this point, prophets were kind of a semi-professional gig, right? You had to be trained for people to take you seriously. It's not like anybody just automatically knew about the law and had the blessing of teachers and could just say something that would matter. But that's what Amos did. Amos is just a shepherd, and as Brad mentioned, he also got sycamore figs, and he just was burdened by what was happening and was frustrated that the prophets weren't doing anything about it. So he took it upon himself to go and address it. And what's interesting is that we call Amos a prophet now in retrospect. He's listed among the prophets, but he didn't think that he was one. He didn't have the credentials, right? So we actually have this very short but lovely section in Amos chapter 7 where we get a little bit of a background story into what's going on in his life. And he has this encounter with a priest named Amaziah, who's a corrupt priest who's just sold out to whatever Jeroboam wants him to do. And Amaziah is trying to get him to get out of here. He's like, look, you've got no right to speak, go away. And he acknowledges it. He says, I am no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I'm a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. And the Lord took me from the following flock, and the Lord said to me, go prophesy to my people, Israel. The authority of his words didn't come from who he was, but from what God had said to him. He'd had an encounter with God, one that was so distinct that it says that God took him from his flock. He couldn't stay there anymore. He had visions and he heard words and he just had to speak them. And this had a tremendous impact on the prophets that would follow. Now, Amos is listed in kind of the back section of the prophets in the Bible, but he's actually one of the very first, if not the very first, of the prophets to have written things down, coming before Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and all these folks whom we are more familiar with. And they all have, if you read their books, don't start out by saying, well, I am a prophet who was trained by this prophet or who's descended by this person and who therefore has something to say. Instead, what they do is they describe their encounters with God. These all are people who had a vision, who had a moment. God appeared to them, spoke to them, moved them, and that's what gave them the right to speak. And this is something that they felt empowered to do because a random shepherd from Tekoa had done so many years before them. Despite not having the right credentials, he felt like he had to say what God was putting on his heart to say. So what about Tekoa, right? Like you caught that, right? That it says that he's this prophet from Tekoa. Well, Tekoa is mentioned a few times in the Bible, but never with enough information about it that we know anything interesting or significant. That really the only detail from Tekoa that is important for us to know is that it was located in the southern kingdom of Judah. Remember that I noted that there had been a split that had already been in place for quite a long time by the time that Amos was on the scene. And Amos was actually living in the southern kingdom of Judah when he felt so concerned by what was happening, so moved by God, that he crossed over into the northern kingdom of Israel and began speaking about all of the things that the northern kingdom of Israel was doing wrong. And as you can imagine, this did not go very well with the prophets there. I mean, first of all, they didn't like anybody speaking out against them. Second of all, not a shepherd. And third of all, certainly not a shepherd who wasn't even from their community, who was an outsider, right? Like, what business does he have to speak? And so another part of that little narrative section that we have in chapter 7 tells us that Amaziah said to Amos, "Seer, go flee to the land of Judah, earn your bread there, and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is the temple of the kingdom." Basically, he banished him. On behalf of King Jeroboam II, he said, you need to leave Israel now. You're not allowed to be here. And most scholars think that it worked, that he did, that Amos didn't have the connections or the power or the safety, whatever, to be able to continue prophesying in the northern kingdom of Israel. So he went back to his homeland in Judah. But Amaziah should have been a little bit more careful with his words, because you'll notice here that he says, fine, you can prophesy there in Judah, just don't prophesy here. And because he was locked out, possibly, from the northern kingdom, he did something that prophets hadn't really done before. He started writing down his prophecies. He can't travel up there, but he can still write about it. He innovated. He came up with a new way, even in his limited situation, to continue doing his prophetic work. And this is his book is actually one of the oldest books of the entire Bible. It doesn't strike us that way because I know we have a lot of material before that. You hear about the time of David and the kings and the judges and all of these folks, but a lot of those materials were written long after Amos's time. Amos really set a new tradition as a new kind of prophet, as one who could write things down. And we're all beneficiaries of that today because we still have his words and the words of the prophets that came after him in our scriptures. Now, you might think that this was kind of cowardly, right? Well, it's a lot safer to be able to write from the safety of Judah than to have to deal with it. I'm typing. I don't know why I'm typing. I'm sure he wasn't typing. To be able to write from the safety of Judah than to be able to speak directly in Israel. But that is not the case, because he was an equal opportunity offender, right? So you'll notice even in our material today, he doesn't let Judah off the hook either. They're on the list. For the 3 sins of Judah and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they've rejected the instruction of the Lord and has not kept his statutes. Judah certainly heard of it. And we don't know what happened to Amos at the end, but there is a very popular, a very old, I should say, rabbinic tradition that says that Amos, after coming back to Judah and writing the book of Amos and continuing to minister, ended up making King Uzziah of Judah just as mad at him as King Jeroboam of Israel was, and Uzziah ended up killing him by putting a hot iron to his head. So he's certainly not a guy who is afraid to speak the truth. He's just a person who is not bound by traditional understandings of who a prophet is or what prophecy has to look like in order to do that. He was willing to speak the truth and speak out against even his own people. And I think that point in particular is something that we should take a moment to appreciate. Amos did what many people in our time say is the hardest thing for someone to do: to speak out against your own tribe. It's one thing to point to the other side, to the enemy, and say, yes, what they're doing is wrong. It's another thing to risk being alienated by your friends and supporters and say, no, what you're doing is wrong too. And Amos had the courage to speak the truth to everyone. And that's something that in the age that we live in is particularly hard. It's always been hard to speak against your own tribe. But with the influence of social media making us so divided, with different news outlets becoming increasingly politicized, we find ourselves being drawn to one side or the other in these big social debates and religious debates, whether we want to or not. Many of us have never even said, well, I'm a Democrat, or I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative, or I'm a progressive. But you hear increasingly news and views from one side against the other. You find yourself getting frustrated increasingly with one group of people more than the other, and we get sucked into this kind of divided landscape. And even if we are not trying to be divisive, we might find that we are selective in the kinds of things that we complain about and say. I will confess that this is true of me, that I haven't been posting on Facebook much anymore, but back when I did, when things bothered me that came from one side, sometimes I felt like I really needed to speak out about it. It was my duty. When something bothered me that came from the other side, I was like, well, it's not really my place to say anything. There's a selective silence that is reminiscent of the selective silence of the prophets of Amos's day. And unfortunately, that's all it takes to make society morally bankrupt and corrupt. once we become afraid to say anything that might offend the people on our own side, even if we didn't intend to pick a side, then we find that we are in a kingdom that is heading for destruction. This was a part of Amos's message. Perhaps the most offensive part was when he said, to Amaziah specifically, "Now therefore hear the word of the Lord. You say, do not prophesy against Israel, and do not preach against the house of Isaac. Therefore the Lord says, you yourself shall die in an unclean land, and Israel shall surely go into exile away from its land." If we don't listen to folks like Amos, then the consequences are dire. Now, at the time, that must have seemed laughable. Remember, this was during the most prosperous reign of the most prosperous king that the northern kingdom of Israel had had since the time of the United Monarchy, right? Things were going well. They were rich. They were powerful. They didn't think they had anything to worry about. But as it turned out, Amos was right. Because it wasn't long after that at all that all of a sudden the Assyrians showed up on their border, got into a series of conflicts with the northern kingdom of Israel, and just maybe 40 years or so after the time, 30 or 40 years after Amos's ministry, completely wiped the northern kingdom of Israel from the political map altogether. It's not that he was trying to be mean. He was trying to speak the truth. And it was a truth that people needed to hear. I think that we find ourselves in a morally fraught moment in our own history. I'm not going to make a prediction about whether the United States is going to vanish in the next 30 years or anything like that. But I think that it is important for us to think very carefully about what it means to be prophetic in this time. Yes, it means speaking out when we see evil happening in other places. Amos did that too. He named war crimes committed by the Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines. It was worthwhile to name them and to prophesy against them, to let people know that God was not happy with that. But with just as much vigor, even more so, he was willing to speak to his own people and say the things that they didn't want to hear too. May God give us the courage to follow in that.